The year was 1865, and the dust of the frontier carried more than grit. It carried ruin. The sun, low and unforgiving, hung heavy in the sky as Evelyn Moore stood at the door of her father's cabin, watching the riders approach. 5 of them, all in wide-brimmed hats, faces shadowed beneath the brim, their horses kicking up a haze of dirt behind them. Evelyn's heart raced, and her breath caught in her chest. She knew they weren't here for kindness. Her father, Elias Moore, a man of too many vices, too few debts paid, had gambled his way through life until there was nothing left to hold but a dwindling reputation and a few coppers that could barely buy a meal. And now his debts had come due. The men riding toward them weren't lawmen, not even bounty hunters. They were debt collectors, sent by the ruthless men her father had once owed to, and now the price was steep. Evelyn's hands gripped the doorframe as she watched the dust settle around the rider's boots. She saw her father through the window, sitting at the worn kitchen table, his face drawn and pale. She had heard the rumblings of what was to come, but the reality of it hit her like a fist to the stomach. The man leading the group was tall, built like the land itself, hard and unyielding. His name was Matthew Cole, and he had the look of a man who'd seen more violence than he cared to remember. His dark eyes locked onto the cabin, and he tilted his head slightly, as though he had already decided what he wanted before he even set foot on the porch. Her father stood then, but he wasn't the man he used to be, strong and full of pride. The years had stripped him of that, leaving only a shadow behind. He wiped his brow with a trembling hand as he walked to the door. His voice cracked when he spoke, a brittle sound, desperate. I don't have the money, Matthew. I don't have it." Matthew Cole's eyes narrowed, and he nodded to the men behind him. Without a word, one of them reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of paper. He handed it to Elias, whose hand shook as he took it. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She knew what it was. The papers were a contract, binding, unyielding. Her father had signed his life away in a game of cards, and now it was time to pay the price. "You'll pay what you owe, Elias," Matthew Cole said, his voice low and cold. "One way or another." Evelyn stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. "What does that mean? What do you want from him?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. Matthew Cole's eyes shifted to her, and there was something in them, a dark flicker of understanding. He glanced back at her father, who stood there, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Your father's debt is too great to be paid in coin, girl. But you," he glanced over her with cold calculation, "you're worth something." Evelyn's heart stopped. She took a step back, her legs nearly giving way beneath her. "No, you're not." The words failed her, leaving only the sickening taste of dread in her mouth. She couldn't believe what he was saying, but there it was, clear as day. "Your father owes a debt, and I've come to collect." Matthew's voice was hard, like the stones beneath his boots. "You're his payment." Her father looked away, his face ashen, unable to meet her eyes. She didn't know whether to scream at him or run from the horror of it, but there was no place to run. "No," she whispered, stepping backward until she hit the wall. I'm not anyone's property." "You are now, girl," Matthew Cole said, stepping forward. His hand came out, grasping her arm in a vice-like grip that sent a jolt of panic through her. "You'll come with me, and you'll stay. That's the deal. Your father's life for your body." The words hit her like a slap, and her vision blurred with hot tears. She wanted to fight, wanted to kick and scream, but she knew it would do no good. Matthew Cole was not a man who cared for pleasantries or protests. He was a man used to getting what he wanted. "No," she said again, her voice breaking. Please don't do this." Matthew Cole shook his head, the corners of his lips twitching into something resembling a sneer. "The debt's been paid, girl. You're coming with me." Her father finally spoke, his voice strained. "Go with them, Evelyn. You've got no choice. Don't make it worse than it already is." Her heart cracked, but she knew what he said was true. There was no fighting this. She was bound by a debt her father had incurred, one that had been passed down to her like an inheritance she never wanted. With a final, heart-wrenching glance at the man who had once been her protector, she allowed herself to be led out the door. The heat of the day pressed in on her like an invisible hand, as Matthew Cole pulled her along toward the horses. The men followed in a loose formation, the sound of their boots in the dust the only noise that filled the silence between them. Evelyn's mind raced as she walked, her feet dragging with every step. The world felt as if it was closing in around her, each breath harder to draw. She glanced over her shoulder, but her father had already retreated into the cabin, the door creaking shut behind him. She was alone now, alone with these men. As they reached the horses, she hesitated. One of the men, his name was James, pushed her roughly onto the back of a horse. The leather of the saddle was cracked. It smelled bitter and old. She stiffened, trying not to look at the others, but Matthew Cole's presence loomed over her like a shadow. "You'll get used to it," he said, his voice an ominous promise. "Your life's not yours anymore. You belong to me now." Evelyn felt the sting of his words in her chest, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. She didn't have the strength left. The ride was long, each hour dragging by as the sun sank lower in the sky. The land stretched before her in an unbroken sea of yellowed grass and dried earth, and the further they traveled, the smaller her world seemed to become. By the time the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the pain in her heart was sharper than the saddle beneath her. They reached their destination well after dark, a sprawling ranch on the edge of a river, its silhouette barely visible against the inky sky. Colt Barringer's Ranch. The name alone was enough to send a shiver down her spine. He was a man of mystery and rumors, a rancher who kept to himself, rarely seen outside his compound. Evelyn didn't know what to expect, but nothing could have prepared her for the way the place felt. It was cold, lifeless, a place that had known more loss than it ever should. She was led into a modest cabin, the walls bare except for a few pieces of weathered furniture. The smell of wood smoke hung in the air, mingling with the scent of dried earth. The only sound was the distant howl of wolves, echoing across the plains. Matthew Cole stood in the doorway, watching her with a knowing look. "This is your new home," he said, "for as long as you're here." She said nothing, her body too numb to feel anything. She wanted to scream, to tear at her clothes, to run, but she was trapped. And somewhere in the depths of her heart, she knew that this was just the beginning. Colt Barringer had his price, and she was it. The next morning, the first light of dawn filtered weakly through the cracks in the cabin walls, casting long shadows over the floor. Evelyn woke to the sound of a rooster crowing somewhere outside, but it didn't bring the promise of a fresh start. The night had been long, the air thick with tension and the stench of fear she couldn't shake. She hadn't slept much, not that she could have, even if she had tried. The bed was small, hard, and unfamiliar, much like everything else in this place. She rose slowly, every muscle in her body aching from a long ride. Her hands trembled as she brushed the dust from her clothes, feeling the weight of her situation settle deeper into her bones. She didn't belong here. She never had. And yet here she was, stranded in the middle of nowhere, bought and sold like cattle. The faint smell of cooking meat drifted in through the cabin's thin walls. She hesitated, then pushed herself to the door. Outside, the cold morning air slapped her face, sharp and unforgiving. Her eyes were still bleary with sleep, but she could make out the shape of the ranch house not far off, the smoke from the chimney rising in lazy curls against the pale sky. There was a well-used path leading to the barn, and in the distance, a row of horse stables. Everything looked empty, abandoned almost, save for the occasional flicker of movement. A tall man stood near the corral, his back to her, staring out across the barren land. His shoulders were broad, his stance rigid, as though he could have been carved from stone. His shirt was weathered and faded, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the thick muscles of his arms. The man didn't move as she stepped closer, though she knew he must have heard her. There was something about him that was unsettling, something too quiet, too watchful. Colt Barringer. He didn't turn when she spoke. Instead, he gripped the wooden fence with a rough hand, his face a mask of stoic indifference. "You want to get to work. Chores need doing." His voice was low, gravelly, a man used to speaking only when necessary. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat dry. Chores, she echoed, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. What did he expect from her? She wasn't a rancher's wife. She was a prisoner, bought for a debt she hadn't incurred. He didn't seem to care about her confusion. Horses need feeding, water's low. You'll fetch the firewood too. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face her fully. You're not here for sightseeing. The words stung, but Evelyn stood tall, the small flicker of defiance in her chest refusing to die. I'm not a servant. I'm not here to be used. Not your choice, he said simply, turning back toward the land. There was no anger in his tone, only the cold, hard truth of a man who had long stopped caring about anything but survival. Evelyn took a step forward, but her feet felt heavy, like they were tied to the ground. She glanced around, trying to figure out how to make sense of this place, how to make sense of him. There was no softness in the way Colt Barringer carried himself, no kindness in his posture, just a man hardened by grief and time. And yet, there was something there, a flicker of something behind those eyes, something that she couldn't quite place. She watched him for a long moment before she finally spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. What happened to your wife? Your son? The question hung in the air between them, a brittle thing, fragile. He didn't turn to look at her, but his shoulders stiffened, and she saw the muscles in his jaw clench. They're gone, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. They died. Comanche raid. Evelyn's heart lurched. She hadn't expected him to speak so plainly. She hadn't expected him to give her anything at all. The weight of his words settled on her like a stone, but she pushed it aside. She wasn't here to learn about his past. She was here to survive. Sorry, she muttered, more to herself than to him. She had no idea what else to say. She didn't want his pity, didn't want to see the way he closed off every part of himself whenever the past was mentioned. He didn't respond, instead nodding toward the barn. The horses. Get to work. Evelyn stood for a moment longer, watching him as he turned back toward the horizon, his eyes narrowing against the wind. There was no tenderness in him, no sign of the man he once was, if he had ever been anything but this, hardened, distant, and unmoving. Without another word, she walked to the barn, her boots kicking up the dry dust beneath her feet. Inside, the scent of hay and leather filled the air. The horses shifted in their stalls, their hooves clinking softly against the wood. The task ahead was simple enough, feeding, watering, brushing, but it felt like an eternity in the making. Each movement she made seemed to echo in the quiet, the sound of her hands on the leather reins and the rattle of the water bucket louder than it should have been. She worked quickly, though her mind was far from the task at hand. It was difficult to ignore the fact that she was alone in this place, with a man who was a stranger in every way that mattered. There were no other women here, no other souls to turn to for comfort or guidance. She was entirely on her own, left to navigate a world that she hadn't asked for. By midday, she was covered in dirt and sweat, the muscles in her arms burning from the hard work. She had fed and watered the horses, stacked firewood, and even mended a fence that had fallen apart in the night's wind. There was no time to rest, no time to reflect on the hopelessness of it all. She worked because it was the only thing she could do. Her heart pounded, her lungs ached, but she kept moving. She was pulling the last of the firewood into the cabin when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She didn't turn, but she could feel his presence before she even saw him. Colt Barringer. Done? He asked, his voice as flat and direct as it had been that morning. Evelyn didn't look at him. Yes, she answered, her voice tight. I've done everything you asked. There was a long silence, and for a moment, she thought he would simply walk away. But then he spoke again, and his voice was softer this time, still rough, but different. You did good, he said, and for the first time since she arrived, there was something approaching warmth in his tone, something that resembled approval. She turned then, her gaze meeting his for the first time since the morning. There was something in his eyes, something that made her feel like she had earned a small victory, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet. It was more than just words. It was the first real connection between them, however small. For a moment, Colt didn't respond. He only stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his boots heavy against the ground. Evelyn stood there for a moment, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to feel anything. But she did, and that scared her more than anything. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Evelyn sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the colors change across the sky. The wind had picked up again, and she could hear the sound of coyotes in the distance, their howls filling the empty air. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if she would ever leave this place, or if she would find a way to make peace with the man who had bought her. But for the first time since she had arrived, she felt something shift inside her. Something that wasn't just survival. Something that might one day be more. But for now, she would wait. Wait and see what came next. The days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next with the steady rhythm of work that never ceased. Evelyn's body had begun to adjust to the demands of the ranch, her muscles hardening under the strain of labor. She moved with purpose, a silent acceptance settling over her as she learned the chores that kept this place running. There was a certain quiet dignity in the work, feeding the animals, mending the fences, hauling water from the well. But it was also a reminder that she was not free. She had no choice but to keep moving to survive. It wasn't just the labor that wore on her. It was the silence. Colt Behringer had settled into a routine, and so had she. He spoke little, his presence in the house limited to the necessary exchanges. When he did speak, it was usually to give an order or to ask for something done. His voice was like the land, rough, unyielding, with no room for softness. But there were moments, fleeting ones, when she caught a glimpse of something deeper, something buried beneath the hardness. A shift in his eyes, a fleeting touch on her shoulder as he passed by. Small gestures, but they left her unsettled. She couldn't figure him out. One morning, as Evelyn made her way toward the barn, she saw him standing by the fence again, just like he had on that first day. His back was straight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The wind tugged at his shirt, and his long, dark hair shifted with the movement. There was something about the way he stood, something that spoke of quiet strength, of a man who had seen more than his fair share of suffering. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to him. Without thinking, she walked toward him. She'd worked with him in silence for weeks, but now, something inside her urged her to speak, to ask him something, anything. The ranch felt too quiet without the sound of conversation, without the clatter of voices. And Colt Behringer, as much as she resented the power he held over her, was the only one here. When she was close enough, he turned his head slightly, but didn't speak. His eyes met hers, and she felt that familiar tightening in her chest. It was the same look he always gave her, distant, guarded, unreadable. She swallowed hard, her voice coming out quieter than she intended. "What happened to your land? It's different from other places I've seen." He didn't respond at first, his gaze returning to the distance, to the brown expanse of fields and open sky. It was as if the land itself was a part of him, a part of his soul that he couldn't explain. But then, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice softer than before. "It was my family's, my father's before me. The land, it didn't take kindly to me. I've tried everything to make it work, but there's only so much you can do. The drought came, the cattle died, and then his voice trailed off, and for a moment, Evelyn thought he wouldn't finish. But he did, his words heavier now. "The Comanche came through, took everything, left me with nothing but the dirt beneath my feet." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She had heard stories, rumors, whispers of the raids, but to hear it from him, to see the weight it carried in his eyes, it hit her harder than she expected. He wasn't just a man of land and livestock. He was a man of loss, a man who had fought and lost. And she realized, for the first time, that he wasn't indifferent to her situation. He might be distant, even cruel at times, but there was something about his pain that mirrored her own. She hesitated before speaking again, her voice gentler this time. "I didn't ask for this," she said, the words almost escaping her before she could stop them. "I didn't ask to be here." He turned his gaze toward her then, and his eyes seemed to soften for just a moment, a flicker of understanding. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced once more by the hard edge that had become his mask. "No one asks for much in this world, Evelyn," he said, his voice steady, though it carried the weight of years of hardship. "We don't get to choose our paths, but we walk them anyway, whether we like it or not." Her chest tightened at the words, and for a moment, she wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that she had no choice, that her father's debts had shackled her to this place. But she couldn't. He was right. This world, this brutal, unforgiving place, didn't care about her choices. It never had. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." There was a long pause, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't say anything at all. But then he nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a beat longer than usual. "You'll learn to survive here," he said, his tone more like an observation than an encouragement. "The land doesn't care about your sorrow, and neither do I. But you can't give up." His words stung, and she felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. She wanted to lash out, to scream at him that he had no idea what she had been through. But she swallowed the fire in her throat, knowing it wouldn't do any good. Colt Berenger didn't care about her grief. He didn't care about her pain. He had his own demons to fight, his own battles to win. "I won't give up," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "But I won't be your prisoner either." His eyes darkened at her words, and for a long moment, there was a tense silence between them. But then, to her surprise, he turned and began walking toward the barn without another word. Evelyn stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected him to leave, but she also hadn't expected him to react at all. She watched him go, her mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. It was clear that this was not a man who could be easily understood. He wasn't the villain she had first imagined, nor was he some noble figure. He was something in between, grieving, hardened, and deeply alone. The days continued to pass, each one as lonely and demanding as the last. Evelyn found herself growing accustomed to the work, to the isolation. She didn't speak much to Colt Berenger, though they crossed paths often. She learned not to expect kindness, not to seek understanding. The ranch was his world, and she was nothing more than a small part of it. She did what was expected of her, but nothing more. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Evelyn stood outside the cabin, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked out over the land, the vast emptiness of it both terrifying and awe-inspiring. There was a strange peace in the solitude, a peace she hadn't expected to find. But then, a sound caught her ear, the faint sound of hooves in the distance. She turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat as she saw him. Colt Berenger, riding back toward the ranch on his horse, his silhouette outlined against the setting sun. He was alone, and his face was set in a grim expression. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she wondered what had brought him back. But as he dismounted and walked toward the barn, he didn't look at her. He didn't say anything. He just disappeared into the shadows. And for the first time since she arrived, Evelyn felt a deep, unsettling sense of uncertainty. What was his plan for her? What was his true nature beneath the walls he had built around himself? She didn't know, but she would find out. The days that followed were a blur of hard labor and quiet tension, the air thick with unspoken words. Colt's presence seemed to loom over everything, his silence like a wall between them. Evelyn had come to expect his coldness, though it still stung each time their paths crossed. He was a man of few words, a man who had long ago buried any softness beneath layers of grief and stubborn pride. Yet there were moments, small moments, that kept her on edge. A glance that lingered too long, a gesture that seemed almost protective. But these were fleeting, and each time she tried to make sense of them, the wall came back, stronger and more impenetrable. She had no illusions now about her place in this world. The ranch was no sanctuary, no home. It was a prison, and she was its inmate. But as the days wore on, Evelyn found herself unable to stop watching Colt. There was something about him that both repelled and intrigued her. His pain was palpable, raw, and though she despised him for it at times, she also couldn't help but sympathize. It was late one afternoon when the storm hit. The wind howled through the land like a pack of wolves, pushing the dark clouds across the sky in a violent rush. Evelyn had been gathering firewood when she first saw it, the black swirl on the horizon, the dust rising in thick plumes. A storm, a big one. She rushed inside, throwing the door open with a loud bang. "Colt!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. He appeared in the doorway seconds later, his eyes sharp, assessing. "We've got a storm coming," she said breathlessly. "We need to secure the barn and the livestock." He didn't hesitate, his movements purposeful. "I know," he replied, his voice low and steady. "Get inside, I'll handle it." But Evelyn wasn't about to stand idly by. Her anger flared at his dismissal. "I'm not some delicate lady, Colt. I've worked here long enough to know how to handle a storm." His gaze hardened, but there was something else in it too, something like frustration. "It's too dangerous. Go inside and stay there." Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode out into the storm. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. He was a man who wouldn't take no for an answer, a man who wouldn't let anyone close enough to see the cracks in his armor. But she was done with being dismissed, done with standing on the sidelines. She grabbed her coat and ran outside, her boots crunching on the frozen ground as she followed him into the wind. The storm was picking up speed, the clouds darkening above them. She could barely see through the rain that lashed against her face, but she wasn't about to let him face this alone. Not again. Colt was already at the barn, working quickly to secure the gates. When he saw her approach, his mouth set in a hard line, but he didn't stop. She fell in beside him, grabbing a rope and helping tie the barn doors tighter. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the storm. "I told you to stay inside." "I'm not staying inside while you risk everything out here." Evelyn snapped back, her frustration boiling over. "You don't get to shut me out, Colt. Not anymore." For a moment, he just stared at her, the intensity of his gaze enough to make her heart skip a beat. His jaw clenched, but then he turned back to the barn, his hands working faster now. "Fine, but you stay close, understand?" Evelyn nodded sharply, her pulse quickening. They worked in silence for a time, the sound of their movements drowned out by the wind and rain. Her hands were raw from the ropes, her fingers numb with the cold, but she kept going. There was something about this, something about the urgency of it, that made her feel alive, like a part of the land itself. As they finished securing the barn, a sharp cry cut through the storm. Both of them froze, their eyes snapping toward the herd of cattle grazing in the field. A few were already spooked, moving erratically. The storm was driving them into a panic. "Get to the corral," Colt shouted, his voice carrying through the chaos. "We need to get them in before the storm gets worse." Without another word, they both sprinted toward the corral, the wind howling in their ears, the rain slashing at their faces. The cattle were running wild, their hooves pounding the ground as they bolted in every direction. Evelyn's heart raced as she tried to focus, tried to herd the panicked animals toward the fence. She could hear Colt shouting at them, but it was a battle. The storm made everything harder, every movement against nature. One of the cows veered off, charging toward the fence. Evelyn saw it coming and lunged forward, her hands grabbing for the rope at her waist. "Move, damn it!" she shouted, but it was too late. The cow slammed into the fence, knocking a post loose. "Watch out!" Colt yelled, but it was too late. Evelyn's feet slipped out from under her as the storm reached a fever pitch. The ground was slick, the mud thick and unforgiving. She crashed hard, her side slamming into the earth. Pain shot through her ribs, but she didn't stop. She rolled, her hands grabbing for anything solid. Her fingers found a post, and she gripped it tightly, forcing herself to her knees. She looked up just in time to see the cow charging at her again. Panic surged through her chest. She didn't know if she could move fast enough. The cow was only a few feet away now, its eyes wild, its body a blur in the storm. Before she could even react, she saw Colt. He was there, his horse galloping through the storm with terrifying speed. Without hesitation, he yanked the reins, pulling the animal to a stop just inches from her. He dismounted in one smooth motion and shoved the cow away with a powerful swing of his arm. "Get up," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Moo!" Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She barely registered the pain in her side as she ran with Colt, both of them working together now, pushing the cattle into the corral. They managed to get the last of the herd inside, the storm battering them relentlessly. But it wasn't over. They still had the barn to secure, still had to make sure everything was safe. And as the storm raged around them, Evelyn found herself doing something she hadn't done in a long time, trusting someone else. Trusting Colt. Despite everything between them, despite the tension and the hurt, he had been there when it mattered. The last of the animals were corralled, the barn locked tight, and the storm had finally begun to subside, though the wind still howled. Exhausted, bruised, and soaked to the bone, Evelyn stood beside Colt in the fading light. They were both covered in mud, their faces streaked with rain, but they had survived. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn looked at Colt with something other than resentment. There was still tension between them, still a mountain of unspoken words, but in that moment, something had shifted. The wall had cracked just a little. Colt looked at her then, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that for the first time wasn't anger. It was something softer, something almost human. It was the first sign of warmth she had seen from him in weeks. And though the storm had passed, Evelyn knew their battle was far from over. There were still too many things left unsaid, too many truths buried deep between them. But for the first time, she believed that they might be able to face them together. At least, she hoped they would.